Webster defines somebody that acts like a fool as somebody that meddles or tampers thoughtlessly or ignorantly. Foolery is described as a foolish act, utterance, or belief, foolish behavior. To be foolish is to be lacking in sense, judgment, or discretion. Do those problems still exist? We've talked about the book of Proverbs as the wisdom book of the Bible, and it is. So many statements, so many verses that really kind of stand on their own. Sometimes the parallel is a comparison of a positive and a negative. Sometimes that second half of the verse elaborates on the first. But there are statements of truth that are found all through these 31 chapters. It really is the wisdom book of the Bible. And it deals with the way that people approach life, the way people approach one another. Whenever you hear somebody say, well, the Bible is just an ancient book, it's an ancient piece of literature, and it really has no bearing on culture today, you might ask them, have you read Proverbs? In fact, have you read much of any of the Bible at all? Because the person that makes that kind of comment that it really is an antiquated book and it really has no bearing is either talking out of ignorance or I want to say hypocrisy. Because if they know what it says and they stretch that conclusion, there's some problems. If they don't know what it contains and they have reached that kind of conclusion, a verse I want us to eventually get to, but I want to mention it now. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. What does that mean? He who answers something before he investigates all of the ingredients of that topic, reaches his conclusion before he looks at what that topic includes, isn't wise, isn't intelligent, isn't acting in a way worthy of a PhD behind his name. He's acting in a way that's foolish. So does the Bible really relate to situations we find today? We've talked about wisdom and understanding quite a bit, and wisdom and understanding and knowledge are terms that you find all through this 31-chapter book. But included in that, within the book of Proverbs, is the most concentrated listing of things dealing with foolishness that you find anywhere in Scripture. In fact, over 80% of the times you find the term fool, and there are several terms in Hebrew for fool or foolish. Over 80% of all those verses are found in Proverbs. I'd like for us to talk about just a few of them from basically 4 chapters, starting with chapter 10. In chapter 10 of Proverbs, a statement is made, the wise in heart will receive commands, but a prating fool will fall. Now, the word for commands deals with precept, instruction, teaching. So the wise in heart will receive instruction, receive teaching, but a prating fool will fall. It's a contrast. But what does a prating fool have to do with the wise in heart? Prating deals with the idea of somebody that's talking almost in incoherent ways. They're answering in ways that really don't relate to the subject. It's like they don't comprehend the topic, or if they do comprehend it, they're evasive. That's not the aspect of one that is speaking with wisdom, or the one who's endeavoring to learn more of what they need to know. In fact, one verse that is mentioned in chapter 12, verse 15, which most people probably have heard. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. It's almost saying the same thing as what we have here in chapter 10. The person that is wise is a person that listens to all of the evidence. The person that is foolish has made his determination regardless of what the facts are. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. The way the fool is right in his own eyes. Here, the prating fool will fall. To stay in chapter 10 for a moment and look at verse 23. To do evil is like sport to a fool, but a man of understanding has wisdom. To do evil is like sport to a fool. The second part of that, a man of understanding has wisdom. Common sense is something that he utilizes. The fool doesn't. To do evil is like sport to a fool. Common sense has been thrown out. And in place with evil, there's an evil intent in what he is focused on doing. Doesn't matter who he hurts. As long as he enjoys it, that's fine. That's not wisdom. That's not even intelligence. The wise has some understanding about decorum, how things should be, how one should act, even in response to things that have been negative against him or her. Retaliation is not something that the wise do in violent ways. Remember that statement we talked about several days ago, Romans chapter 13, the statement made that love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. We see problems with that kind of concept in our culture because there are people that are very much throwing common sense aside and have a heart that is intent on doing evil. That's not the definition of wisdom. Go from chapter 10 of Proverbs over to chapter 14. I want to notice some statements made in verses 15, 16, and 17. In verse 15, the simple believes every word, but the prudent considers well his steps. The one that's prudent, the one that's wise, is going to be taking a look at all of the details before he determines what course his life will take. The simple believe every word. Individuals that act foolishly are gullible. They're not waiting around to find out if what they're hearing is actually correct or not. They'll go along with everything. Scripture elsewhere describes individuals of that nature as people that are just driven by any kind of wind that blows in their direction. They'll change their belief at the drop of a hat. That's the kind of gullibility that's pictured here in Proverbs. The simple believe every word, but the prudent, the wise, are not going to make a decision until they analyze and take a look at all the evidence and the facts. Verse number 16, a wise man fears and departs from evil, but a fool rages and is self-confident. The fool is driven by anger, by rage, by hatred. One who is wise, not driven that way. That's not the motive. The motive of the one who is wise is to depart from evil. That evil intent is not in their makeup. The person that is foolish, here's a phrase again, a fool rages and is self-confident. Believes that rage and that anger and that hatred is justified. It's not. Never can be justified. The very next verse, verse number 17, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. This verse is not a contrast. The second phrase builds upon the first. The individual that is quick-tempered, that's a mark of foolishness. If you got a short fuse, need to lengthen it. Short fuses, as far as anger is concerned, are not examples of wisdom. And the individual that is of wicked intent is not going to be the favorite individual of anybody unless it's somebody of that same kind of bent, that same kind of intent, with that same kind of wicked kind of ingredient in their heart. And sooner or later, they may start fighting among themselves. It's not the mark of wisdom. The simple, in verse 18, inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Verse 18 really talks about rising above those surrounding certain circumstances. If you're surrounded by any individuals that are acting in foolish ways, you don't have to go along with the crowd. You shouldn't. That shouldn't be a part of actually what you do. There should be something that's different. How do I respond? The very last verse of chapter 17 is intriguing. What it states is that even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. If he doesn't talk, you may think this person is extremely wise. The very last half of that verse builds on the first. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. Abraham Lincoln is given credit of the statement that it is better to be thought of as a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Very perceptive statement. If you're not sure about something, don't blurt out conclusions when you don't have all of the facts. If you're not sure about something, don't spout hatred and anger when you actually may be in the wrong. And it may be the case that somebody else has done something that's atrocious, but if you respond with that hatred and anger, that's not justified either. Chapter 18 deals with the concept of foolishness in several ways. In verses 1 and verse 2, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. Those two verses really go together. So I'm not concerned, as a fool, I'm not concerned about understanding. Don't confuse me with facts, because I've already made up my mind. Here's verse 2 again. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. He's made up his mind. Don't confuse him with the truth. And part of the problem in verse 1 is he's kept himself in isolation. He hasn't surrounded himself with individuals that are trying to analyze things, to understand and recognize what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong. He's isolated himself, so much so that he rages against all wise judgment. He's concerned about himself, his own way, and don't tell him anything different from what he's already concluded. That is never the mark of somebody that's wise. If you continue on in chapter 18, down in verse 6, a fool's lips enter into contention. His mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his destruction. His lips are the snare of his soul. It is not the person of wisdom who incites violence. It is not the person of wisdom or knowledge or understanding whose words call for blows against another human being. Just the opposite. We need to be very concerned in our culture that we're following individuals that have understanding and wisdom, individuals that have knowledge. Unfortunately, sometimes they're not the loudest people to shout. Sometimes the loudest people to shout are enumerated in these verses. The fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. The motive of his heart is seen in the very last phrase, snare to his soul. There's one more verse I'd like to mention before we bring this to a close. Verse 13 of Proverbs 18. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. The person who spouts an answer before he knows all the facts of the case, that's not wisdom. The person reaches conclusions before he analyzes all the ingredients, that's not wisdom. The person that takes a stand on a particular doctrine or teaching before he analyzes everything that deals with that doctrine or teaching, that's not wisdom either. So what Proverbs writes, the precepts, the truisms that you find contained in this book, just about being foolish or acting foolishly or being a fool or acting with folly, is something that you can see all over our society and our culture and our world. So when somebody says that the Bible is an antiquated book, it's ancient literature and has no bearing on today, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it's folly and shame to him. If he hasn't read it, but is reaching that kind of conclusion, it's folly and shame to him. Not the mark of a wise individual. We need to be individuals that are always wanting to learn more, wanting to be better. And for the child of God, there's realization that this book is the most incredible book in the world. The way it describes itself in a very accurate way, it's the breath of God. The one that created humanity provides for us a path to follow that can take us down a path of wisdom and knowledge and understanding. It can increase the appreciation for life. It can help us have a greater love for individuals with whom we disagree. But to disregard these kind of precepts will not ever be wisdom. Let's work on being wise always, never being foolish. Interesting study. Read through Proverbs from beginning to end. Maybe even underline or highlight the words for wisdom and understanding and knowledge. Go back and highlight the words for fool, folly, foolish, and see how true all those precepts really are. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.